in Rome do not show us that the spread of democracy will lead to peace. And that's our next theme. The spread of democracy, the advance of democracy, does not of necessity lead to a peaceful world. I've heard so many people say democracy is made for good neighbors. Ask me something. What was the bloodiest war in our country's history? The Civil War. 623,026 Americans died. It was a war between two democracies. Constitution of the Confederacy was very closely based upon that of the United States. Universal white male suffrage, just like the United States. Now, one of the best of the early Federalists, written by John Jay, the founders of our country were not under the dangerous delusion that democracies and republics would make for good neighbors. In fact, he said if you've got 13 republics side by side, they're going to fight all the time. So they have got to be united. They went back to classical antiquity. The greatest war of the Greek world was a war between Athens and Sparta, two alternative forms of democracy. And the greatest war of the Roman world was that between Rome and Carthage, two republics resting upon democracy. Winston Churchill wasn't fooled by this belief. He pointed out well before 1914 that the next war between these democracies would be far bloodier than any war fought under Napoleon. The somber wars of democracy, he called them, in which an entire people are mobilized, only in the total defeat and unconditional surrender of the enemy. Whereas an emperor like Napoleon can sit down with the Tsar of Russia and they just sign a peace treaty, correct? And the war is over after one battle. How did our Civil War end? Would Abraham Lincoln negotiate with Jefferson Davis? Did he? Absolutely refused to. It ended only with essentially unconditional surrender. So the spread of democracy is no guarantee of peace. And President Wilson should have known better, he was a historian, when he talked about self-determination. If only every national group could determine its own destiny, everything would be fine. In fact, the Second World War was a result of that kind of self-determination. And then thirdly, the uniqueness of our own country's history. We have achieved a miraculous blend of national, political, and individual freedom. The Athenian democracy for a short time came close to it, but no other country in history has achieved over such a vast span such a mix of national, political, and individual freedom, and that deludes us into thinking freedom is just one word. You understand? National freedom. We can't imagine being conquered. We cannot imagine it. A German can. A Frenchman can. The Japanese can. The Indians can. We cannot. And two, political freedom. We take it for granted. You took it for granted that you went to the polls in the midst of this economic crisis. 1864, the country absolutely torn apart. We hold an election. President Lincoln could have lost, couldn't he? Probably would have lost if he had not furloughed enough boys to go home and vote in the districts and carry them. Well, who better to make the choice than the men who were fighting the war? And I'm never disturbed, get mad at me if you want to, but I'm never disturbed when not many people go to the polls. That shows they think democracy's working just fine. If they need to work an extra hour that day, they do it, they don't worry about it. That's how much we take our political freedom for granted. And individual freedom, you are freer here than anywhere else in the world. It's just that simple. And you know it. Or a student will raise their hand and say, well, Holland's better. You are freer here than anywhere else in the world. And every day, thousands of people come here searching for just that kind of individual freedom. That freedom to make a better life for themselves and their family. That is the blend that we have achieved. And that blend goes right back to the achievements of our founders. and the unique success of their achievement again makes us think that this same process can be achieved in other parts of the world very easily, following our model. In fact, both Pericles, President Bush, and then when he was candidate, Al Gore, all said, we are a model to the world. Athens is a model to Greece. We are a model to the world. And if they'll just follow our model, they will achieve this same blend. But what did the founders of our country do? First, they declared their independence against the superpower of the day. And they did it by founding this new nation, its national freedom, on principles. In fact, the United States is the only nation in history founded on principles. I want you to think about that. How in 1776 did you get to be an Englishman? You were born there. You were a geographical accident. Who was a German? A German will still tell you, particularly the older generation, you are a German if you speak German as your mother tongue. An Italian, the older generation, will still tell you you're an Italian if you speak Italian as your mother tongue. This ethnicity. We have from the outset proclaimed, come here from anywhere in the world, have any religion, have any mother tongue, but you adopt our principles and you become an American. And what are those principles? We hold these truths to be self-evident. That all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The country was founded on the ideal of natural law, on the ideal of God, and of absolute right and wrong based upon a belief in God. But very quickly in that declaration, they moved to historical fact. And their real indictment of King George was that he had violated their historical rights as Englishmen. Historical rights founded in the unique tradition of English freedom, embodied, for example, in Magna Carta, or in the English Declaration of Rights. And in fact, our revolution was one of the most historically minded revolutions in history. Right down to George Washington taking the Roman dictator Cincinnatus as his model, who was called from his plow to lead his country to victory over a hostile force, and then returned simply to that farming life. A conservative historical revolution. What is probably the biggest city in America today?
New York.
New York. Why didn't we rename it? After all, look at poor St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg, Leningrad, St. Petersburg again. Ill fortune follows a people that renames its cities. Speak to me of Persia, not Iran. Speak to me of Constantinople, not Istanbul. I will not hear of Leningrad, only St. Petersburg. That's what Churchill said. So, we kept New York, we kept New Jersey, we kept Princeton, we kept them all. We have a college of William and Mary. So, we did not throw away. And in fact, when we set about to create the Constitution, it was as closely based on the historical worth of an English Constitution as you could make it. But how did we come to create that Constitution? Because that in itself is a lesson in learning from history. And the ideal that human freedom is not a given. The sweep of history is not towards freedom. The founders knew, based on their knowledge of history, that freedom is very fragile. It has grown in very few places, and the real propensity of people is for a strong ruler or dictator. That is what they look for in times of crisis. In fact, their reading of Polybius, the historian of the rise of the Roman Empire, taught them that governments came into being when everybody was free and you were beating me up all the time. And I went to you because you're a strong man, and everybody did. They said, beat him up and then you'll be our king. So kingship was the natural propensity of the human race.